Hi class, we're going to continue with setting up our cluster. So far what I've done is I've rebooted my domain controller, let it fully come up. Then I've rebooted the iSCSI, the FOC1, and FOC2. I rebooted my iSCSI first, let it fully come up, then FOC1 and FOC2 together. Once everything was fully up, I'm ready to start the lab. The reason why I rebooted all those machines is because they hibernated since the last time I touched this lab. And I did that to avoid any issues. I don't need the WDS, the FS, or the two web servers up and running for this lab. So every time you create a new service on your failover cluster, you most likely have to create a new hard disk for that service. So I'm going to start with my iSCSI server. I'm going to go into File and Storage Services, then click on iSCSI. So I currently have one disk right now for the witness disk. So I'm going to go to All Task, New iSCSI Virtual Disk. This is the server that it's going to be on. I'm going to save it in the C drive in the default location, which is under this directory on my C drive. I'm going to call it DHCP. That's the service we're going to host in our cluster. Right now, we have a DHCP server. But if this one DHCP server goes down, we have no backup. So it's probably not the best way to set up DHCP. But for that lab, it was fine. But to make a more resilient service, we're going to put it on our failover cluster. So if one FOC goes down, the other machine will host the DHCP. I'm going to make it 1 gig. I don't need it to be very big. It's only going to hold my DHCP database. If I had a huge network, I might want to change this to 5 gigs. But for right now, I'm just going to make it 1 gig because we don't have a lot of disk space available on our iSCSI server. I'm going to set it up to be dynamically expanding, meaning it might start off as 4 megabytes and expand all the way up to 1 gig. I'm going to use the existing target, meaning FOC1 or FOC2 can access that disk. Then create. I'm going to give it a minute to create the disk. My disk has been created, so now I'm going to go to FOC1 or FOC2 to mount it. So we've shared the disk on the network. Now I'm going to go to my iSCSI initiator to grab the disk. I'm doing this from FOC1. You could do it from FOC2. It doesn't really matter. We've already have this configured. We're already connected to our iSCSI server. So I'm just going to go to Volumes and Devices and Auto Configure. When I auto-configured, it grabbed that second disk. The first disk it grabbed was our witness disk. It was already there. By doing this, it grabbed the second disk. Now that I have the disk attached to this machine, I need to format the disk. So I'm going to right-click the Start menu, go to Disk Management, and I can see the disk here. It looks like it's locally attached, but it's really over the network. So I'm going to bring it online. I'm going to initialize the disk. It sees this machine as a Generation 1 machine, so it sets it up as an MBR. If this was a Generation 2 machine, it would automatically try to partition it with the GBT partition table. We're only going to have one partition on here, so it doesn't really matter which type we use. So I'm going to leave the default of MBR. Now that the disk is initialized, I'm going to create a new partition and give it a label of DHCP. Then finish. So now I have the disk formatted. I'm just going to go to FOC2 and make sure that it sees the disk. I'm going to go to Tools, iSCSI Initiator, go to Volume and Devices and Auto Configure. So now it sees two disks. I don't care where these disks are mounted, whether on FOC1 or FOC2, but you can't mount them to both. So all we have to do is just auto configure, click OK, and if I want to disk management, I'll be able to see both the disk. It doesn't see the second one as being configured yet, but it will. I'm just going to hit refresh. So I just hit refresh, so it sees both disks are formatted, but they're both offline, or one's reserved and one's offline. The reason being is this one's reserved because it's part of the cluster, and this one is offline because FOC1 has it mounted. Once I've integrated this disk into the failover cluster, it will also say reserved. So I'm going to go back to FOC1. So now I'm going to launch our failover cluster utility. I'm going to expand our cluster, expand storage, highlight disk. Now I'm going to mount that disk into, I don't want to say mount, I want to add that disk to be used in our failover cluster. There's the disk. I can see it. It's attached to FOC1 currently. Again, it could be attached to FOC2. It doesn't really matter. It was disk 2. Disk 0 is the disk with the operating system. Disk 1 is our witness disk that we set up last time. And disk 2 is our DHCP, which is now available inside the cluster. So if you want to configure a service in the cluster, what you need to do is install the service on the machine. So before we can configure DHCP inside the cluster, we need to have the DHC software installed on both machines. So I'm going to close this out. I'm going to go to Manage. I want to add FOC2 to this console on FOC1. I don't want to have to keep jumping back between both machines. I want to be able to manage both FOC1 and FOC2 from this one console. So I'm going to type FOC2 and do Find Now. I'm going to highlight the server, then move it to the right. So right there, sorry about that flyout. So I'm adding this server to this console. It's going to allow me to remotely manage FOC1. So I don't need to keep jumping from this machine to this machine just to manage that machine. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a server group. I'm going to put all 3 machines cluster, FOC1, and FOC2 in that server group. And I'm just going to call it cluster members. And I'll show you why we need this. So I'm going to add all three of those to that one server group. Then move them to the right and click OK. So you see how it created this cluster members group over here on the right? And you can right click it and edit the group or delete it or whatever you want to do. So if I wanted to look at my cluster, look at all the events for any of my cluster members, I can just click on this one thing. If something's going on with a cluster member, I'll be able to see those changes right there. So what I'm going to do is manage, go to manage, add roles and features. Now, when I install something, I can install something on FOC1 or FOC2. So first I'm going to install DHCP on FOC1. Then I'm going to install it again on FOC2. I'm going to pause the video for a minute. Okay, my screen stopped going across. Now I'm going to click, I've highlighted FOC1, click Next. I'm going to install DHCP server, add the tools to manage it. In this case, I might not even need this, but I'm going to install it anyways, because I'm going to manage the service inside the Failover cluster. The only thing I'm going to do outside of the cluster is install it. Restart if needed, then click Install. I'm going to wait till this is done, do it again, but this time I'm going to install on FOC2. I'm going to pause the video again. Okay, it's done installing, so I'm going to complete the configuration, the DHCP configuration. Click Next, then Commit. That authorized the server, and it created two security groups. It authorized the server to pass out IP addresses. Remember, a DHCP server will not pass out IP addresses until it's authorized by the network admin. Click Close, then Close. Now I'm going to go back up to that same utility, Manage, Add Roles and Features. This time I'm going to choose FOC2. Click Next. I'm going to install DHCP on FOC2. I'm doing everything from this one screen. I don't want to have to jump back and forth between FOC1 and FOC2 every time I want to do something. That's the whole point of this management console. It allows me to control multiple machines from this one interface. Just going to walk through the wizard and do the same thing. Give me 1 second. Sorry, I thought I saw an error there. There was one. So I'm going to restart if necessary and click Install. I'm going to pause the video while it's installing. Okay, it's done installing. So now I'm going to complete the DHCP configuration for FOC2. It's going to create two security groups and allow this machine to pass out IP addresses. Click Next. I'm going to do it with my admin authority, then Commit. Close. Then close this. Just for giggles, I'm going to go into DHCP. I'm going to right click DHCP, then manage authorized servers. And I can see that I have 3 authorized servers. 1 for our old lab and the 2 that we're doing right now. If we wanted to, we can also authorize the cluster. I don't know if this is needed, but I like to do it anyways. There's my cluster, sorry. Give me 1 second. Here's something that I made a mistake on. When I had you set up the cluster, I had you use this IP of 10.0.0.100, and that was also the IP we're using for the wwws. And I should have used a different IP address. It didn't cause me a problem because I don't have these 2 machines running. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the DC DNS. Yeah, I should have used a different IP. I didn't, because I was looking at it as 2 different labs. Because when we're in class, I have a completely different setup instead of what we're looking at right here. So I'm going to go to DNS, go to contoso.com, and for this record, I'm going to change it to cluster. Actually, I can't change it, so I have to delete it. And then I'm going to create a new record for the cluster. We'll call it cluster and give it an IP address of this service resolves names to IPs. So I need to be able to resolve the name cluster. Actually, it was already done for me. So I had 2 entries for that same IP. I need to be able to resolve cluster to that IP. Even though that's not a real machine, that's only a computer account in Active Directory, I still need to resolve that name to an IP. I should have used a different IP address, I didn't. So I just deleted that record for www so we don't have this issue. So I'm going to go back to FOC1. So I'm going to press cancel to go back to the screen where I'm adding the IP address. It's still not working. So I'm just going to erase that and just type in the name. Cluster.contoso.com. And I'm just going to change this name as well. I know it's fixed. Click OK. So I have my cluster authorized to pass out IPs. I have 2 each independent cluster member passing out IPs, authorized to pass out IPs. Click OK. So that's the only thing I'm going to do on the real machine in regards to the clusters, is just install the DHCP software and then authorize the servers. So now I'm back on my Failover Cluster Manager. If I click on Nodes, I can see I have 2 members. Both are currently up and both have a vote. My witness disk also has a vote. I go to storage, I can see I have 2 disks. One being used as a voting disk, one is available to use. And I have my cluster and client network. We didn't really have to do anything, this was automatically set up. So once you've installed the role on the real machine, you now need to install the role in the cluster. So I'm going to configure that role in the cluster. Click Next. So we're going to do the DHCP server. These are all the things we can put inside the cluster. A DFS namespace server, a DHCP, you haven't gotten to that yet. We can set up a file server in the cluster. We can do a replication broker in the cluster. We can actually do our iSCSI server in the cluster as well. We can set up virtual machines in the cluster. For right now, we're doing DHCP. I'm just going to do this file server one time just so I can show you something. Well, it's not going to allow me to do that because I didn't install the role of file server. The only thing I've installed the role was the DHCP server of both cluster members. You can't walk through this wizard if their role isn't installed on the real machine, or at least in at least one cluster member. So right now DHCP server is installed in both, but I'll show you this file server some lab before I'm finished. So I'm going to do DHCP. That's what I'm going to call this service. It's going to create a link, excuse me, it's going to create a computer account for the DHCP in Active Directory. So it's going to look like it's a separate server altogether. I'm going to give this an IP of 10.0.0.151. Some of you might have used 150 for your failover cluster, which is good, leave that alone. This is going to be the next available IP. Click Next. It's asking, do you want to use any storage for this service? And we're going to use that disk that we added to our cluster. That's free, that's not being used for anything. We've added 2 disks. First one we're using as a witness disk. Now this one's going to be used for DHCP. And the reason why we need to use a disk that's not on the real machine, but that's part of the iSCSI service, is because if this machine goes down, I want DHCP to jump over to this second failover cluster member. If I saved all the data for the DHCP locally, not on an iSCSI disk, then when it jumps over, it wouldn't know about any of the settings for the DHCP server. So what we do is we put all the settings and all the databases for DHCP on this disk. So when the service jumps over to the other machine, so will the disk, and then that service will be aware of all those settings. So this is going to store all my DHCP settings that can jump from either machine. When the service jumps, the disk will jump as well. It doesn't have to, but generally that's the case. Click Next. Click Next. Then Finish. Now while I'm waiting for that to come up, I'm going to go over to my DC DNS. I'm going to go to Tools, Active Directory Users and Computers. And I can see under the computer container, there's that computer account it just created for the DHCP service. Also, if I go into DNS, it's going to resolve dhcp.contoso.com to that IP address that I used. So regardless of what machine that DHCP service is on, it will always have that same IP address. Regardless of which machine the DHCP server is on, it's going to save all the data on the disk that we're mounting from the iSCSI. So none of that DHCP information is being saved locally on FOC1 or FOC2. So I'm going to go back to FOC1. So now here's our first role we're hosting in the cluster. Up until this point, we just set up our cluster. Now we're actually starting to use the cluster to host roles. So I'm going to right click this, manage DHCP server. Now when I look at it, it's not connecting to any one machine. It's connecting to that computer account for DHCP. So I'm just going to create a simple scope. A new scope. I'm going to call it private. And in the description, I'm going to put in my subnet address and the subnet mask I'm using for this network. I'm going to put in the first available IP for the subnet and the last available IP for the subnet. Our subnet mask is /24. I don't know why it's doing that. /24. I'm going to exclude the ones we're using. I'm going to go to 160 because I'm using .100, .150, .151. So I'm just excluding all these addresses. The scope will be aware of the addresses, but I'm not going to be assigning them to devices. Those are the IPs we're using statically for our servers. Click Next. Again, we're doing DHCP lesson in the next class, so I'm not going to go into detail about this. Our gateway for the network is 0.1. It automatically populates our domain name and our DNS server. So now my DHCP is fully configured in my cluster. If I go to the real machine and I look at this utility, I can see the scopes there automatically. You don't want to configure it here because the data, if you configure it here, the data will be stored locally. If you configure it in the cluster, the data is going to be stored in the DHCP disk, and I'll show you. I'm going to go to the DHCP disk. I can go to it because it happens to be mounted on FOC1. And inside the disk, there's a folder called DHCP, and this is all my files created by the DHCP service. I'm going to go back to my cluster manager. If I wanted to, I can move this over to FOC2. Give it a minute to move. And they gave this feature to move in case I need to take this machine down. So if I wanted to take this FOC1 down, I could manually move everything over to FOC2 before I did. So right now, FOC2 is running the DHCP server. If I go to disk, it also moved the disk over to FOC2. You can see the disk is no longer mounted to FOC1. So I'm going to go to FOC2. Sign in. So I can see that DHCP, the disk, is mounted to FOC2. The witness disk is mounted to FOC1. And I can see that currently FOC2 is hosting that service, the DHCP service. Okay, guys, so this is our first service we're going to host in our cluster. We're going to do some more in a little bit, but for this lab, this is where I'm going to end it. If you need me, please text me. I'll get on the network and help you correct any issues that you might have. Okay, that's it for this video. Thank you.